Good morning. Nicola's Tuesday afternoon speech, long awaited and trailed, if you like, as the route map to Indyref2, didn't disappoint in the sense that it was radical in two key aspects, possessed of considerable clarity, and addressed the absolute essentials of the big question which has been gripping Scots for far too long. Where the hell are we at in our struggle for Scotland's independence? Now, the Unionists awaited it and believed that what she would say would be predictable. As a result of that, their leaders had prepared speeches to deliver, which took no account of what she actually said. But in terms of the overall reaction to the speech, let me say that its real significance was illustrated by the fact that it was greeted by Yes activists and Yes supporters with a kind of stunned, I think I like this, but I'm not quite sure what it means. And by Unionists with stunned incredulity, horror, panic, and a recourse to all the most simplistic tropes and arguments which they've been delivering since before the 2014 referendum. So what did Nicola do? She set out the situation as we're in at the moment, and that is that the democratically elected government of Scotland wants to hold a second independence referendum to determine the views of the Scottish people on their constitutional future and to answer the question, do they want Scotland to be an independent country? Beautifully simple, clear cut. And the reality of that situation is that we are being denied by the state that we're trying to exit from, the right to consult the people of Scotland. In other words, the democracy of Scotland, the successive election of successive SNP governments committed to independence, is as not under the Scotland Act and Westminster legislation. They have decided we are not going to have a referendum. They can talk around, this is not the time, once in a generation nonsense. The reality is they have no intention of ever giving us another referendum. They got a monumental fright back in 2014, and they do not want to repeat that. Least of all, this dreadful Boris Johnson, right-wing, confused, chaotic, amoral Tory government. There's no way that they or a Labour opposition, if it ever reached government, are going to grant a referendum to Scotland. Nicola recognises that. So as a lawyer and as a realist, she focuses on what is the situation we face. We have to determine how we get a legally recognised referendum. Recognised not only, hopefully, by the British state, and by Scotland and by the Holyrood Parliament, but by Europe and the world at large, that we are behaving responsibly and trying to act on the democratic wishes of our people. So what Nicola has decided is, although she didn't say as much, she still hopes against hope that this can be done legally and properly. But de facto, she's accepting that we're not going to get the legal referendum she wants, but she has to try the legal process. And she took the bold decision to accelerate that process. So rather than wait for the Scottish Government to produce their bills and seek their Section 30 order, have it rejected, have it referred to the Supreme Court, she has bravely bounced the ball right into the Supreme Court's court, so to speak, to make a decision on this. I think with little expectancy that it's going to be other than a rejection. Now, what is the key next step? I mean, in effect, the question she has to answer, and we all have to answer, unionists and independent supporters alike, is what situation has been created by the denial of the right of a significant proportion of the electorate and their elected government to call a referendum to determine their constitutional wishes on how they want to be governed. There is no more fundamental political decision is ever taken than that. This is at the very essence of how people form a state, how people form governments, how people determine their democratic accountability and how the representative government operates. If we're faced with that denial, to use the maybe tired metaphor, we're in Hotel California. We've checked in, but we can never check out. So Nicola recognises that. Now, what did she decide to do? Well, let me just, if you can hear the words of a proportion of her speech where she addresses this.
Far from it. I said earlier that two principles would guide what I said today: the rule of law and democracy. Democracy demands that people must have their say. So finally, in terms of process, let me confirm this, although it describes a scenario that I hope does not arise. But if it does transpire that there is no lawful way for this Parliament to give the people of Scotland the choice of independence in a referendum, and if the UK government continues to deny a Section 30 order, my party will fight the UK general election on this single question: should Scotland be an independent country? So the path I've laid out today is about bringing clarity and certainty to this debate. Above all, it is about ensuring that Scotland will have its say on independence. I want the process set in train today to lead to a lawful constitutional referendum, and for that to take place on the 19th of October 2023.
So there you have the absolute essence of it. Now, it's interesting that she did not say how the outcome of that general election would be viewed in terms of the position that she had taken on it. In other words, as a de facto referendum. There's been a bit of a stooshy developed since then. I made an assumption at that time, based on what she didn't say rather than what she did say, that she meant the election would go ahead as any general election, UK general election, goes ahead, and which the Scottish Government has no capacity to change the terms of that. In other words, we would elect MPs to constituencies, and the government would be determined by the number of MPs elected, which party could form a majority, and go to the Queen and say, we can form a government. Nicola is certainly not naive enough to do as some idiot unionist commentators are suggesting today, determine the outcome of a UK general election or the framework of it. She is doing exactly what any political party does, presenting itself to the electorate in an election and saying, here is the basis on which we stand. What she has done is narrow and focus the basis of where we stand, leaving aside the whole question of government under a devolved settlement under the limitations and, frankly, the choke chain of the Scotland Act, to say this is a government elected by the Scottish people, mandated by the Scottish people to call a referendum, defining a single issue that they want to present themselves to the electorate with. And that is, do you want Scotland to be an independent country? If so, vote for us in this election. Now, she recognises clearly, everybody recognises, that it does not become a de facto referendum outcome. But it is perfectly legitimate for the Scottish Government if they received a majority vote, and I'm talking about a majority vote of constituency MPs, the number of MPs elected, to conclude that that is the will of the Scottish people expressed clearly and fully. It doesn't alter the way in which the general election operates, in which that Parliament would be formed, but it does massively strengthen and clarify the mandate that the Scottish Government would then have. Now, there is another strand to this which has been present way back since the rigged referendums and has bedeviled the debate throughout, and that is a parliamentary majority sufficient to give a government a mandate on any specific or in general terms, or does it require a majority of the electorate voting? Well, there is nothing in the British system that requires a majority of the electorate voting to form a government. There is no such constitutional position. Had there been, the majority of elected governments over the last God knows how many years could not have formed a government and would not have been legitimate. So that argument is totally illegitimate. And I have assumed, and continue to assume, that that was Nicola's intention, not to talk about the majority of those voting, but the conventional process of government, of electing this, as to see. Now, subsequent confusion was caused by the failure to address this key point. The media didn't understand it, activists didn't seem to understand it, and it now seems that even a cabinet minister, John Swinney, of a huge experience of covering decades, didn't understand it. So that was, frankly, a bit of a cock-up. It doesn't invalidate what has been said. So what Nicola is saying is, I would love this to be a legal, properly done referendum, similar to the one that was carried out in 2014, with a different result, obviously. But I recognise the reality that it's highly likely that we are approaching a position where we are going to have to answer the question, when they say no, what do we do? And this is Nicola's answer. And I still feel, with multiple reservations and still trying to get my head around the dynamics of it, that it was the right thing to do and possibly the only road forward. It, of course, begs a huge question. What happens when we get the result that we hope for from that general election, which is de facto an endorsement of Scotland's right to call a referendum and consult its people? So it's not the trigger for independence, it's not the trigger for anything, it's the beginning of the road. It's how we act on that result that matters. Now, Unionists, when scrabbling around, always managed to find an academic who was either a friendly academic in the sense they share all the values of the Union and are in essence Unionists, or whatever their constitutional position and however objective they think they are, they see the thing in the legalistic terms and the grand narrative and framework of the Union. And they've popped up with Professor Mitchell. Now, Professor Mitchell makes the claim that Nicola, in this approach, is trying to redefine the terms of the British Constitution. So, frankly, Professor Mitchell, that's a load of utter nonsense. As you very well know, the British Constitution does not exist as a written constitution, and it is not a legally based constitution. It's a politically based constitution, and is being used and has been used ruthlessly and expediently in that manner before and will continue to be so. So, despite rather irritation at Nicola and John Swinney making that little balls up of clarification on the point, I still stand with Nicola's approach, think it's the right approach, and think it's a viable approach. Of course, as yet, I can honestly say I cannot now be absolutely clear what Nicola intended, despite what I've just quoted here. But I think we have to stay with it. The Herald today is filled with the Tom Gordons and the Alison Rowett's with supposedly objective comment. Now, I would not claim to know that Tom Gordon is a unionist, or Alison Rowett is a unionist, or Neil Mackay is not really the Yes supporter he claims to be, or Kevin McKenna is not really. I cannot make such a claim. All I can do is make the old statement. If you walk like a duck and quack like a duck, you're indistinguishable from a duck, and you have to be treated as a duck. So I intend to stay with Nicola. She's going to have a hard time in this, but everything in that speech tells me she is not only the right leader for the independence movement, but the only possible leader. She stands head and shoulders above any of the opposition leaders, and frankly, she makes her critics look like a bunch of amateurs. Now, I'm not a celebrity fan of anything, whether it's pop music or politicians, but I do have a considerable admiration for Nicola. I've been highly critical of her in the past on specifics. I hope that was recognised as the voice of a critical friend. And as an old man, hopefully now that I might see Scottish independence by the time I'm 90, which is not too far off, that we're on the right road at last. So I hope this has been of some value to you, even if only to disagree violently with it. So, bye.